Long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series and beyond. I am your host, Constant Reader Scott Dilly, and I'm joined, as always, by the newest expert of the territories. It's Matt Freeman, the man himself, Travelin' Matt. How's it going today, Matt?
It's going great, Scott, and like you said, I can answer any question about the territories. I have a very clear and complete understanding of all of the metaphysical mumbo-jumbo. And I'm just ready to field your questions.
All right, here we go. Question number one, Matt. What is the territories?
Oh, jeez. It's probably like a metaphor for something. Let's just move on.
Pass. This week on the show, we take one last look at Stephen King and Peter Straub's Black House. What did we think of this book overall? What's it about? Why is Black House? We're going to answer all these questions and more. And then we will move on from our friend Peter Straub. And it's going to be sad to see him go, but also a very exciting time.
Yeah, it's always exciting to wrap up one thing and begin something else.
Absolutely. Before we get into everything this week, though, Matt, we just wanted to remind folks that we do have a Patreon exclusive bonus podcast we do every month. We call Other Levels of the Tower. The whole concept of this is basically you and I watch Stephen King adaptations and talk about them for about an hour. Not too complicated. This month, we are talking about Stephen King's Christine and the John Carpenter adaptation. A movie that I swear to God, I thought I had seen because I've read the book at least twice. And then I sat down to watch the movie and I realized quickly, I don't think I had ever seen this movie. So we haven't actually recorded that episode yet, but I think just because of that alone, it's going to be definitely an interesting conversation that y'all want to hear.
It's funny whenever that happens. It seems to happen a lot where you and I are one of us is like, yeah, I've seen that. And then it's like, no, we saw a totally different movie with a similar name or something.
Yeah, I was trying to think of that. I was trying to think of like, what movie could I think that I had seen? And you know, honestly, probably what it was is like, it's such a, like, if you are a Stephen King fan, like, I feel like a John Carpenter version of a Stephen King story is just something that you have to see. Mm-hmm. And so it just got to the point where I just kind of assumed that I had, because why wouldn't I have?
Yeah. It's Occam's razor.
Yeah. But yeah, so we're going to be talking all about Christine. I am very excited to have that conversation, which means you should be very excited to hear that. If you're listening to this right now, it means it's already out. So if you're a patron, you should go check your audio feed because it should be out there. And if you're not a patron, head to patreon.com/doofmedia and sign up at the, what's it called again? We need to make our names clear at the Doof Troop level or higher, which will give you access to that show. And I think we're up to like 16 other episodes of Other Levels of the Tower.
Yeah. Head on over there and correct your mistake and sign up.
Indeed. Because, you know, sometimes we release these to the public, but you can't count on me getting sick all the time.
No.
Or maybe you can lately.
Yeah. Just as of June 2022.
Yeah. Before we move into the episode proper, though, Matt, speaking of getting sick, we said last week when we got to the end of our episode that we were going to do the discussion questions from last week this week. We're not gonna do that. Basically, we were looking at it. We were looking at the structure of the show and how it would work, and it just like there was no proper spot to slot them in that made sense. I think we'll like kind of generally reference what the overall listener community thought of these two books based on me reading the questions beforehand and kind of digesting who everyone liked and which book everyone liked best. And we'll summarize that as we go through our conversation today. But it just didn't work. And sorry about that, but just wanted to be upfront and honest about that. We don't like it when that happens, but we were really, I think both Matt and I were sick last week when we were recording the episode, and we were really exhausted by the time we got to the end, and we just didn't have time to fit it in then, and then it just didn't make sense to right now. So
yes, we'll call it a casualty of the dark month, and we will never speak of it again.
Yes, it is over. So we're going to just have our brief conversation, and then we're going to go into some mailbag questions, which will hopefully spur some more conversation about Black House and the Talisman, and of course, as always, the Dark Tower. So let's get into it, Matt.
All right.
So I guess the first question I have to ask you, Matt, is the most basic question of all. what's this book about? What is this book trying to say? What's it trying to do? Here you are at the end of this whole thing. What do you think? Has your opinion changed since we kind of talked about it a couple weeks ago, or have you seen it and thought on it any more clearly? What is this book about?
Well, definitely we're doing a lot with the concept of grief and loss and how different people react to loss. There is kind of looking at it holistically, right? You think about like what are the worst losses you can imagine, or yeah, let's phrase it that way. And the space the book is playing in is sort of this like almost unspeakably horrible idea of parents whose children are being murdered, which it's almost like canonically the worst thing that can happen to a person. And the grief that is inflicted on these parents. And then also at the same time, we have, our main character, Jack, who takes his time in sort of arriving on the scene in a, interesting way. We'll probably talk about that separately. And he's also dealing with his own grief, but he's dealing with it very differently. And that's the loss of his mother. So, you've got a child mourning their parent. You've got parents mourning their children. Very much the notes of this parent-child relationship from both sides. And then also it spends a lot of time dealing with, the anticipatory dread of loss, because a lot of it isn't just the loss. It's people dealing with the feeling that the loss may happen and the fear of it. You could even say, to connect the two books, the entirety of The Talisman was born of Jack Sawyer dreading the death of his mother and doing absolutely everything he could to keep it from happening. And then this book is obviously dealing with the fact that it happened anyway, right?
Yeah.
So I'll stop there. But to me, it's like that. To me, is kind of the Rosetta Stone, or the beginning of the Rosetta Stone for connecting what might seem to be disparate elements of the story into an overall thematic picture. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I love what you said there, and it actually kind of clues me into a thing that I was kind of wrapping my head around. This idea that The Talisman is a book about a child being terrified to lose their parent, and Black House is a book about parents being terrified to lose their children. And, one of the questions I was going to ask you, and I think that it just kind of perfectly dovetails into this conversation, so I'll go ahead and ask it now, is that there's a pretty big time difference between these two books, right? Between The Talisman and Black House. Decades went by between our two authors writing these books.
Yeah.
And the central question of, what changed for them over this time? How did they change as people, and how are those changes as people reflected in these novels? And I think that's it. I think when you're young, one of the worst things you could imagine is losing the people that take care of you, and as you get older, you come to grips with your own mortality a little bit better. But one of the worst things that you could possibly imagine is losing the people that you take care of. And I think that perfectly represents these authors, transition from young men writers, trying to write about childhood, to being parents and understanding what it is like to lose a child, or not literally understanding. I don't think either of them have lost children, but just like understand, like having the realistic grasp of what that must feel like, even the potential of that, and how terrifying that would be,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely the core of it. I mean, pretty much as you said, when you're okay, I mean, both of my parents are alive, and
yeah,
the idea of them dying seems like among the worst things that could happen, and yet almost certainly that will happen. And that's kind of a truth that I don't really want to ever have to think about. But shoot, I mean, you kind of have to, and this book really kind of asks you to, right? And I also have kids, and so I talked a lot about how how much that part of the story affected me, the part with the children being taken by the serial killer. And between these two things, I think this book is really challenging you to think about the inevitability of the end of these relationships that are kind of the most important thing in your life.
Yeah.
And it's really heavy, actually.
It is. But I mean, also, if you think about, again, like the difference here, the death that Jack was working so hard to prevent in The Talisman was a natural death. You know, as I guess as natural as you want to call cancer. You know, it was a thing that happens to people all the time. You know, and the deaths in this story are a monstrous, brutal. You know, I guess maybe you can call fishermen a cancer of children if you wanted to. You could get there, but you know that is like you can't like. There's nothing Jack Sawyer could do in real life to cure his mother's cancer, right? Whereas the characters in this book can like literally rescue people from the serial killer that is kidnapping and eating and killing children. So I think that is an interesting, you know, diversion of the two stories as well, is that like you have a character who's fighting against the inevitable in a lot of ways. And in this story, you have a character realizing that they shouldn't do that and using the knowledge of that to stop what is not inevitable and what is horrible, is the death of young people, the death of children, you know, like that's not supposed to happen. Right. Like people get old and they die all the time, but like young people dying, people in the not even yet entering the prime of their life, that's not supposed to happen at all.
Yeah. Right. That's an interesting idea that it's, you know, he had kind of checked out of the game of being a capiceman, at least in part, in my opinion, you know, because he didn't feel like it mattered. Maybe like, hey, if I put in all of this effort and I still lose what matters to me, then maybe, you know, it's almost like kind of nihilism. And I think being confronted with the horror of a monster that preys specifically on children, and it's so like offensively unnatural, and it like shocks you out of that nihilism almost. Yeah, no, I agree, because I you know, we talked about it a couple weeks ago about like maybe this is the White kind of trying to push Jack towards French Landing, and he's just not taking the bait, and so it has to be a little bit more forceful with the whole dead Speedy thing. But this idea that his grief and his running and hiding from the events of his childhood were preventing him from stopping the really, really bad things. And it's not until he fully accepts, understands, and processes that grief, processes the loss of his mother, accepts it, takes that sorrow into him, allows it to be there without completely running from it, that he is able to enter the Black House, save Tyler, save the world type stuff, you know? Makes sense. I like it.
So yeah, I mean, I also, you know, I don't know. I think we've talked about Stephen King and his mother a lot between these two books, and it always, I say this every time we talk about it, but I feel the need to say it again as like a preface. It always makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable making any of these books too biographical. But I don't know, a man that loses his mother to cancer writes a story about a kid desperately like traveling the world and to stop his mother from dying of cancer. And then 30 years later, he writes a book where, oh, she died of cancer again anyway, just, yeah, you know, later. I think that's a really fascinating choice of someone maybe coming to terms with the fact that, oh, like I wrote this fantasy where I saved my mother and prevented her from dying. And then as I became an old man myself, I realized that, oh, like even if I had saved that thing, you know, like she's still going to die. That's like your parents die eventually. That's just something that happens. And so I like to think of it as him processing that his own loss in that regard. I don't know. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think maybe he ended that book, you know, the way he ended it. He ended The Talisman with this feeling of like, yeah, you know, victory. We've marshaled literally the forces of the cosmos, and we have saved mom. But also like then he gets older and he's like, you know, that can't be the last word on that, because that's not what happened. And also, you know, I have a lot of stuff to say about how grief can affect a person.
Again, it's like it makes me feel awkward doing the reading into the biography thing too, but you have to assume when a writer is putting stuff into a character, they're getting it from somewhere, and which means they're either getting it from their imagination out of whole cloth, which is not that usual actually, or they're getting it from their life in some form, even if it's kind of twisted and reformed into something new. So he probably learned a lot about how human being deals with that kind of grief.
Yeah.
And he maybe channeled some of that through Jack Sawyer.
And I think it's so fascinating, the idea that the way Jack finally truly learns that lesson is by losing someone else, by losing Henry Layton, right? It's as if to say we cannot fully even allow ourselves to get through that without maybe experiencing it again, but experiencing it again as perhaps a more mature person. And they're allowing us to see this stuff from a different angle for the first time. I think that's such a fascinating choice. Cause there's different ways you could write the story that he learns to get over the death of his mother through, hundreds of different ways. But the fact that it was by experiencing another death that he could not prevent, that we chose to go this angle with it, I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, that's true. And I think stepping back from it, a huge amount of Stephen King and The Dark Tower, just stepping back from the huge tapestry of it, is about the death of loved ones, right? This pair of books specifically does focus very, very much on this parent-child relationship from both sides of the fence. But what is the last thing that Eddie says to Roland, right? It's turning a relationship which is sort of a mentor relationship into effectively a parent-child relationship.
Yeah.
There's a lot of just the terrible sorrow of losing the people who are closest to you all throughout all of these stories. I mean, even from the beginning, even from Salem's Lot, we have a man loses his lover and friends, and the boy loses his parents. I think maybe at that time King hadn't experienced enough of life to really hammer in how horrible that would be. Not that I'm not really criticizing it in that way, because it's I don't even know how you would write that. Yeah, I think it's something that he's very concerned with overall.
I think you're right.
Yeah,
I think you're right, and I wonder if you continue to climb this particular tower, and you get high enough and look at literature from a high enough angle, if just storytelling just becomes an exercise in dealing with loss of loved ones.
Yeah. I mean, isn't the joke always that Gilgamesh is the oldest story we have, which references itself as being a very old story. And then also it's about trying to cheat death.
Yeah.
So it's we've always been concerned with this.
Yeah. I mean, that's why we kill people in books so often, right? Because death is this thing that it is the one thing that we all have in common is that we're all going to die. And it is the one thing that it maybe doesn't terrify all of us, but it's something we all are reckoning with and thinking about. And so it makes perfect sense that, cross culture, cross history, cross time, all of our stories wound up in this concept of death, and not only dealing with your death, but dealing with the death of the people around you. Yeah.
Well, I think it just to riff on that for 1 second, I think there's a school of thought. I forget the name of this exactly, but there's a school of thought that we are indeed all terrified of death. It's just that as a culture and as individuals, we push it down so far that we don't realize it. So we are subconsciously terrified of it, and so that's why literature is able to get us by playing with that, is because it's something we almost can't confront consciously except through the medium of something that's entertainment, something that kind of makes it fun and abstracted and not real.
Yeah, I like that. The more we tell stories about it, the less quote unquote scary it becomes. It's we're shining a light on the thing that terrifies us the most and pretending like it doesn't scare us anymore.
Yeah, at least for that moment. Yeah.
I like that. I like that a lot. So with all that being said, did you like this book overall?
I did. I think I still kind of stand by the complaining that I did the first week, where it was just such a weird set of choices in terms of how the book began.
Yeah.
But once we got past that, I don't know if I want to say, I don't know if I want to throw the word favorite around casually, but this book definitely affected me more than most of the other books we've read in this podcast, on a level of like feeling dread and empathy with the characters, and like hope for them, it just worked on me perfectly. I'll just put it that way. Like if the authors wanted me to feel a feeling, man, did I feel that feeling. So I loved all of that. It just worked on me extremely well, and I fell in love with Henry Layton. I even loved a lot of the more side characters. I just thought it was really, really excellent. Yeah, that is my final answer. Is once I got past that weird beginning, I really loved it. Yes.
Yeah. You know what's funny about that beginning? I really remember the book, before I came into this whole project, as a book that has like 100 pages that are a real drag to get through. And then the rest of it like completely changes in tone and style from there, and is a great read that you really enjoy. The thing I was so surprised about in this book is not that, the first 100 pages are not the most like centralized, condensed version of that particular style, but that actually that style pervades the entire book. It's just a little bit more broken up. And like the thing I realized is I actually don't mind that style of storytelling and prose at all. It's just when you pile it up on itself that much in a row, in that many pages in a row, in that condensed, that it just stops working on me. Because like there's moments all throughout this book where Straub and King switch right back to that exact same style they had in those first 50 or 60 pages, right?
Yeah.
It's exactly the same. There's nothing different about it. But it's just because they only do it for a few pages and then we move on back to the story. It's just like I still don't really understand the decision to sit with it as much as they did at the beginning of the book.
Well, I think fundamentally I agree. It's not the sort of floating camera gimmick or the speaking to the reader gimmick that bothered me. It's the fact that I was just confused about what was happening at a pretty basic level. Like I don't know who these people are. I don't know what's going on. It's not like a fun puzzle. It's like there's no way I could figure it out given the amount of information that I have on hand. And so I'm just going to have to kind of wait for you to get to the part where you start to lay this out in a clearer way, or introduce me to a character who I can kind of latch onto and begin to sort of see the world from their perspective. I almost want to say like, I don't, it's not even, you can begin a story jumping between character point of views.
Yeah.
It's just, you have to make me actually understand what's happening. And I didn't, I was confused. And, the thing is, I bet if I reread it, I wouldn't mind it nearly as much. And the reason is, well, now I know what's happening because I've read the story. So I'd probably be like, yeah, this is fine. What was I complaining about? And it's like, well, clearly the first time you read it is going to be different.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So I guess I think I already know the answer to this question, but when you stack this thing up against the Talisman, which book comes out ahead?
I definitely enjoyed this one more, and this one affected me more. The Talisman certainly had its highlights. The stuff that jumps to mind about the Talisman would be Wolf and everything in the Sunlight home, just as being really powerful and I don't know, just affecting me a lot. And then also, I really love the part when they take the train through the wasteland. I just love that like surreal, weird shit. But and it's not like it was bad. Other than that, I clearly enjoyed it. But I think this book just was kind of better at everything it was trying to do. I think the authors, show clear improvement in their skill as storytellers. I do kind of wonder if that's like a consensus opinion, or if people are split on that. Like, yeah, I'll just ask you, like, which of the two books is your favorite?
Yeah, I think, and it might be recency bias, but I think right now I'm leaning Black House. I think there are individual moments in the Talisman that I enjoyed more, and I think we talked about this at the end of our Talisman series. That, you know, the Talisman is a book of great individual moments that don't just quite add up. This is a book that I think maybe doesn't have as high of highs, but I think overall maintains a better cohesive, interesting, thought-provoking story throughout. And I agree with you. I love the character of Henry Layton a lot. I mean, I loved Wolf, but like, I don't know. I loved Wolf in a kind of like, oh, yeah. Like, I love Henry Layton and like, oh my God, how did you create this person? Yeah. Kind of way. And those are two very distinct things that I think, you know, I think the latter is much harder to do than the former.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. Yeah, right. Like, maybe this sounds horribly arrogant, but like, I feel like I could write a character like Wolf, because the secret to Wolf is, well, he's adorable and he's naive and he's innocent. And I guess the fun aspect of Wolf really is the fact that he also turns into a monster, which is, you know, they do a great job with that. But Henry Layton, I'm like, where did this guy come from? Like, this is just so fresh and interesting and new. But yeah, I mean, the parts of Black House that are going to stick with me are probably like the worst thing, like a mother finding her son's organs in a fisherman's creel. Yeah. It's going to stick with me till my dying day. And that's a very different emotional tenor than anything that happened in the Talisman.
Yeah. Yeah, and just for your knowledge, to kind of summarize, you know, when we asked this question to our listeners, what the overall opinion was, most people went with Black House. I mean, there definitely was a contingent of people that really, really liked the Talisman and liked that book more. But I was kind of surprised to see the number of people who said, no, absolutely, Black House is the better book. And I agree with him. I think the thing about the Talisman is, I think the Talisman is a much more, and we kind of talked about this last week, I think. The Talisman is a much more traditional, I don't want to say safe, because that sounds mean, but like, just it, you know what it's doing, and like, you know where you're going, you know, like, you just like, almost literally, because the path is laid out in front of you. They tell you at the very beginning of the book exactly where we're going. We're going to the West Coast and we're going back again. Like, it's the Odyssey. It's the hero's journey. It's like, it's all these things that are much more recognizable. And so from the, like, a reader's perspective, it's like, it's a much more comfortable read, even if there are terrible things happening in it. And I don't want to minimize the horrible things that our characters have to encounter in that story. This is a more uncertain book, a much more, you don't quite know where you stand or where we're going with this, or what's going to happen, or who's going to make it out of this thing, or how exactly the ending of this book goes. I mean, I think you could probably, if you had to, like, guess that they're probably going to save Ty, maybe. But even like, I feel like even like the concept of, oh, we can save Ty isn't really introduced until like halfway through the book.
Yeah.
So like, you just have to sit in this knowledge that, okay, so there's a serial killer and now another kid has been taken. Right. I guess we're gonna solve the case? Question mark.
No, you're totally right that it's very late in the book that we even realize, like, okay, the plot is we're gonna save the kid. It's not at all clear. And yeah, no, the fact that it's a hero's journey, the fact that the Talisman is a hero's journey, I think contributes to this feeling of like, yep, I'm not really surprised by anything that's happening. Whereas in this book, you're constantly surprised by everything almost. Like, I remember how like surprised I was that Jack Sawyer was going to be the main character. And what's funny is, it's like, it should have been obvious. Should have been totally obvious that Jack Sawyer was going to be the main character, but the book waits so long to tell you that you're like, well, I guess it can't it can't be Jack because we would have found out by now. And then when it finally gets around to telling you, and then not just telling you, but then you finally like go into Jack's head, that you're like, oh my God, really? Like we took this long to meet the protagonist of the story. and clearly that's intentional, right? Like I don't know why exactly. I don't know what the rationale is exactly for waiting. And I think my guess is that it's trying to sync us up to the extremely hesitant frame of mind that Jack himself is in. Mm-hmm. Like he doesn't want to be part of this story. He's just trying to live his life. He doesn't want to be the protagonist. He was the protagonist last time. He did his thing. He succeeded. He still lost. He says, fuck this. I don't want to be the protagonist. I'm not going to be your protagonist. And the story literally has to like stalk him through the bushes and pounce on him to con him into being the protagonist. That's my highly meta theory for why they began the book in the weird way that they did.
I think that's wonderful. I think you're totally right there. That's great. I love it. I love it so much. Good. I never thought about that way, but yeah, 100%.
Because you just have to ask the question, like, why on earth would you do it this way?
Yeah.
And that's all I can think of.
No, yeah, you're totally right. So, I mean, speaking of Jack, what do you think of Jack Sawyer as a Stephen King protagonist as compared to all the other protagonists that you've seen in this whole series so far? How does he stack up? Because one of the responses to our discussion question from a couple weeks ago was from a listener who did not like Jack very much at all. Doesn't care for them as a person or really a character. So what do you think of Jack Sawyer?
It's interesting because I think I can totally see where that person's coming from. Not that I necessarily have the same emotional reaction, but he's an interesting combination of too perfect and a little bit of a jerk. Mm-hmm. Which I can definitely see as being unlikable qualities. Yeah. I think the being a little bit of a jerk part is sort of part of what I see as King's image of what a gunslinger is, where it's like you have to be willing to knock heads together to be a gunslinger, even if that's not like what Jean-Luc Picard would do. It's necessary sometimes. Sure. And then the being too perfect part, it's like, well, then unfortunately, that's kind of the DNA of Jack Sawyer, is that he is this golden-haired wonder boy. Overall, my feeling toward Jack is one of like, that's our boy, because you saw him grow up, you saw him go through struggles. You kind of get that he like earned his current state of perfection, if you will, by going through a lot of struggles. But I can totally get just not really feeling that and just being like, nah, I still don't like him. Do you feel similarly?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I kind of wished they would have leaned a little bit more into his, to me, obvious, like reluctance and uncomfort with being labeled that way and being loved by people. Like one of the things that like, the people point at when they talk about how Jack's kind of a jerk is how he deals with Dale at first. That he buys this house from this man who is clearly like completely enamored with him, and he buys this house. He invites him over to help him unpack stuff. They spend hours and hours unpacking stuff. He like does the thing where he's like, "Well, sure am hungry." But then he also like puts like one toe into asking Jack a question about his past, and Jack just completely shuts down, sends him home without dinner, and just says basically "fuck off, guy." And I like that sucks. But I mean, I think part of that actually is Jack dealing with the uncomfort of Dale clearly like seeing him as this godlike hero person. And I guess I wish the book like flashes moments of this a few times throughout. And then of course we're told about how, Jack stopped gambling because it was so boring to win all the time. It just didn't feel fair. But like, we just don't see it that much.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost as if it's a remnant of a part of his life that happened between the books rather than the version of the character we see right now. And I guess I just wish I saw a little bit more of that.
Yeah, maybe this isn't entirely fair, but it feels told but not shown.
A little bit, yeah, a little bit. Not entirely, but a little bit.
Because it is shown a little bit, you're right, but it doesn't. It's I think an afterthought is a good way of saying it.
And it doesn't end up really mattering to the overall narrative of the story.
Mm-hmm.
Like it is definitely a part of who Jack is as a person, and I think part of why we end up kind of content with Jack, having to start a whole new life in the territories, because he clearly was just not a person that was ever happy or home living on Earth. And so this builds into that, and I think that's part of like you can kind of imagine the publisher note of like, well, you kind of leave your character trapped in a place he doesn't belong. It's like, oh, we'll build some stuff into the early parts of the book that make it seem like he belongs there more.
Yeah.
But that's conjecture. I don't know that happened, by the way, but I could see it.
Yeah, no, I mean, when you say that, I also am not going to say that definitely happened, but that's the kind of thing that it kind of feels like. Yeah. One direction I might take the discussion of Jack as a character and the question of like, do you like him is okay. So previously we kind of agreed that the Talisman is like a rough draft of the Dark Tower series, in terms of like plot beats and character beats and what we're doing with it. And I think in some interesting ways, the Black House doesn't quite continue that, because obviously the Dark Tower is being written, is like what, halfway written at this point, something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
So, I'm waving my hands. I don't actually have any way of knowing this. But the point is, Jack Sawyer in this book is kind of like Roland, but it's very interesting to talk about how he's not, because it's like, okay, so let's like kind of like nail it down. It's like, okay, man, he's a capice man. He's a lawman. He's lost his parents tragically. He is kind of alienated from humanity. He's on a quest, sort of. I mean, Jack had a quest. Roland is on a quest. And both of them are kind of assholes. In fact, the funny thing is, Roland is much more of an asshole. Roland does much worse things than Jack Sawyer ever gets up to. Yeah. But I think we like Roland more. And it's actually hard for me to nail down exactly why. I'll just say, like, I definitely like Roland more, despite the fact that I don't know if I necessarily would like to hang out with him.
Yeah. I mean, look, you're so right, because it's like, oh, I don't like Jack because he was mean to Dale one time. Okay, well, Roland allowed a kid to fall into a pit and die. Yeah, but like, that's Roland.
Right.
No, you're so right.
He's such like, that's what's funny is I kind of sketched out some rough things that's similar about them, but it's like, okay, Matt, you're being an idiot. Like you're overlooking all of the enormous number of ways in which they're different. Namely that Roland was like raised in this completely psychotic fashion that led him to be this person who's totally estranged from his own emotions and and grew up in this hell world and had all these horrible things happen to him. And,
yeah.
So, but then on the other hand, part of me wants to be like, well, Jack also had a lot of bad stuff happen to him.
I mean, he certainly did. Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know what my point is exactly. I guess it was interesting to me to compare and contrast those two characters and then kind of confront the fact that I definitely do. I don't dislike Jack, but I like Roland more, and that's confusing.
I mean, I think that's one of the fascinating things about how storytelling and characters work, that like, the exact thing a character does that, like, if they were real people would make you say, definitely don't want to hang out with that guy, is one of the things that kind of endears you towards a character, because you get to play in a world where that's not real. And so it's fine, actually.
And it also takes, like, Roland gets a lot of page space to develop too.
Yeah. I mean, he's incredibly complex. I guess, I mean, do you think that Jack's complex? I guess that's maybe where we could take this question. I mean, I think there are complex things going on in Jack's head for sure. I think the way he's dealing with the death of his mother is certainly complicated. But is he a complex character?
Well, I mean, Roland's definitely more complex, because at the heart of Roland is this kind of contradiction where he's a romantic, who is capable of immense love, which in turn is almost like a curse, because of the fact that he's also continually going to sacrifice things that he loves for what he sees as this mission, or what you could spin and say is an addiction of his. And it's a tragic contradiction in his soul. And Jack doesn't really have a tragic contradiction. He has a tragedy that happened to him, and that he is processing, and that he succeeds in processing. So like that feels satisfying in a certain way. It's certainly not, it's not like it's bad. It's just, it's much more suited to like a single book, or a pair of books, where they kind of set everything up in the first book, and then take an unexpected twist for the second book. And then you're done. Like bam, we're done with the character. We resolve the character, and you can only really like resolve the character if what they had going on was only such and such level of complexity. Whereas I think you could argue that Roland's level of character complexity actually deserved 80 billion words to explore.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that it's not a fair standard to compare to,
Yeah.
Like Roland gets so much more room to be complex because yeah. Interesting. Okay. I guess one of the other things I wanted to talk to you about here is the small town, the Stephen King small town vibe is pretty important to Black House. But I guess the question I had here is kind of, to what end? Because, we've talked about these small town Stephen King stories several times in the past. I mean, the most obvious one being Salem's Lot. And that is very much a book that is exploring, how something like how terrible things happen in a small town and no one seems to do anything about it. Right.
Yeah.
In this story, that's not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily the same kind of small town conclusion, I think. What do you think?
Yeah, you could argue it's more optimistic, because we do, okay, so there is the kind of the almost Needful Things-esque point where it seems like things are headed right for the ditch when the town forms an angry mob to go to the police station, and they're going to go lynch the guy who they've arrested. I'm going to be honest, like I thought they were totally going to do that. Like I thought the odds that they were going to successfully murder that poor innocent guy was like 95%, because that just seemed like the Stephen King thing to do here. It's totally in keeping with his cynical view of people, especially when they form into mobs and when they're scared, and especially when they happen to live in a small rural town.
Yeah.
And then that didn't happen, because Jack talked to them and he had some magic flowers and he successfully diffused the situation. And the Mad Hungarian bashed a guy on the head with a flashlight. And then, past that point in the story, that wasn't really a thing anymore. We didn't really have this, the town is unraveling, and we're, it's almost like, it's a morality tale about mob psychology and about the evil that lurks beneath. It's like, no, we're not doing that. That's not what the story is.
Yeah.
We're playing in the sandbox of when shit goes wrong in a small town, people are going to react in crazy ways, but that doesn't culminate into like becoming the climax of the book.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think you're right that like kind of the point of Salem's Lot especially was this kind of evisceration of the evils that go on in small towns. this is kind of taking a much more, I'm not going to call it nuanced, but it's much more interested in kind of understanding how a normal place could become crazy and lose it in a little bit. Like, you're absolutely right that like French Landing was on its way to becoming awful. And I mean, this kind of gets into the concept of a border town, borderlands, and slippage, which are, terms that are uttered in this book again and again and again. And like kind of the concept of not, because I think one of the things that's important about Salem's Lot is that this rot was kind of present in this town from the very beginning, that it had nothing to do with the vampire that came to town. They just feasted upon what was already there. Whereas you could say a town like French Landing is just a place that is, a very normal place that did not necessarily have any rot in the center of it, that was, kind of turned and started slowly sliding into darkness thanks to the slippage as a portal opens and kind of distorts gravity and everything starts sliding and slipping towards the badness. Yeah.
Right. Because definitely, I think the book wants you to think that that's one possible fate of this town, is that it becomes like a Salem's Lot. Or it becomes like the town that, I guess, was it Mouse, or was it Doc? I forget whoever it was who.
Sonny was the one whose friend just murdered people.
Yeah. Yes, Sonny, who ended up in the abandoned hotel, and it was a place of slippage that had fallen between the cracks of the world, and you could see that happening at French Landing, but then it's heroically reversed by the intervention of our heroes. And I think that's actually a big part of it is like the police chief and Henry Layden and the biker gang. Like, these are all these different elements who have a stake in this town, and they're going to put themselves at personal risk to uproot and expel this evil. And what's funny, this is hilarious actually, and consistent, is like when it comes to Salem's Lot, the police chief was kind of worthless.
Yeah.
Who are the two people who survive? You've got the guy from out of town and the kid who just moved in, right? So nobody within Salem's Lot has like the backbone or maybe ability to stand up to it. I guess the exception would be that like the English teacher and the doctor try, they just fail tragically. And then Callahan's another example of a guy who tries and he just doesn't have the right stuff,
So do you think this is the Straub influence, or do you think this is just Stephen King kind of not softening, but being a little more kind to what small towns can be?
I can see it being just being more kind, and also like that's not the point of this book. In the same way that like I'm just gonna like Insomnia, that's a book that's kind of about a smallish town. It's a town, whatever. I don't know how big the town is actually. Doesn't matter. Do
you remember the name of the town?
Was that Derry?
Yeah, it was Derry.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, but see, the thing is, like, I already know that Derry is like a favorite location of Stephen King, and yet that's not particularly a town where it was about like, oh, and then the town like went insane and ate itself. So yeah, like a singular particular horrible thing happened there that was kind of the result of one dude. And then there were also
nothing bad ever happened in Derry before that.
I guess there are a bunch of complicated other things that happen in that book too. But like it's not that the town went crazy specifically. Like there was a lot of there. I think he has a larger thesis, more complicated than just towns are evil. And I think that this is just that wasn't what he wanted to say with this book.
I mean, I think in this instance, it's specifically like, what can something as monstrous and almost ununderstandable as a cannibalistic child murdering serial killer do to just normal people, right? To just everyday people going about their lives. Like, what can that do to them? How and it's very easy to, sit back in your chair and be like, well, these people are reacting terribly to this and wanting to lynch someone. I mean, that's horrible. But like, it also must be terrifying, you're living in this small town and suddenly there's someone murdering children and eating them, and nobody's doing anything about it. And so this entire concept of safety in this small town where I think they said that like fishermen, it was not a place, French Landing was not a place where people locked their doors very often before the fishermen came. Because it just was, they just didn't think about it. Like stuff like that just didn't happen there. Yeah. And that's just not, it stops being the case. And so the people of the town react in various ways. Some of them stand up and try to fight against it, like the Thunder Five, like you said, like some members of the police force. Some of them lose their shit a little bit, and some of them are opportunistic assholes that take advantage of it and win.
Yeah. I think that's true. That feels pretty fair to me. Yeah. I don't know if this is the exact perfect place to talk about this idea, but this is something that I might have brought up in the course of just discussing things. But like the fact that they basically based these stories on Albert Fish is kind of horrific. I don't know. So just like to tell you where my head's at, like this is a while ago, somebody on Twitter was like, I don't believe info hazards exist. Give me an example of an info hazard. And if you're not familiar, info hazard just means like a piece of information that is intrinsically dangerous or bad to know. And my first thought, which I didn't even share because I don't like hurting people for no reason, was, hey, look up Albert Fish and who Albert Fish was and what Albert Fish did. There's your info hazard. Because I remember, I literally remember, probably back when I was in like a Silence of the Lambs kick, and I was, interested in serial killers in the way that I think a lot of young people are, just because it's like kind of unbelievable that it's real. And I read about Albert Fish and I was like, I wish I didn't know that. I wish I didn't know that was real. I wish I had never read that. This is horrible. This is sickening. And then these fucking guys made a whole book about Albert Fish. And I was like, well, shit. Like as soon as I realized that's where we're going, I was like, oh man, am I going to be okay? And because it's fictionalized, it's kind of, I don't know. It allows you to deal with it in a way that feels a bit more safe. But like the fact that was a real guy is pretty hard for me to confront. And so I guess I bring that up in this context because you were talking about like the effect that kind of thing has on a town. And it's like, I'm sitting here saying that's hard for me to even think about. Imagine if it was actually happening in your own town, it would be like indescribably awful. Right.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. All I could think about while you were talking about that was when we reviewed the film A Good Marriage for Other Levels of the Tower, which is based on a Stephen King short story that he took, like basically is it the BTK killer?
I think so. Sounds right to me.
Yeah. Where he took basically the story like verbatim from the BTK killer and wrote it into this pretty good little short story of his. I was like, King, you got to stop using real life serial killers.
Yeah.
That's so I actually did not know who Albert Fish was before the first time I read this book. So I'd never heard of Albert Fish. I of course made the mistake of looking it up after I learned about it, but not something I learned about. It's not a good person, that guy.
Right. I mean, it was probably like literally 20 years ago that I read about it, and I still vividly remember this because of how like shocking it was, So. All
right, Matt, I think we're coming near the end of our conversation before we move into our mailbag. But I guess the last question I wanted to ask you is, we've spent the last, 20 episodes, so months and months and months living in the world of this combined Stephen King, Peter Straub experiment. And I guess now that we're here at the end of it, because these are the only two books these two have written together, what do you think about them? I mean, what do you think about this combination? Is this a thing that produces books that are better than the Stephen King books that you've read? Is this something that, like, I guess, just what's your overall thought on this thing?
I mean, I think I just really, really like Stephen King and his writing style.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't find Peter Straub's writing style nearly as appealing on just the just the enjoyability level. I don't know what word to use exactly there. And like, I don't know, counterfactually, like, what if Stephen King had tried to write these books on his own? Would they be better or worse? That's an interesting question, because we have no idea what Straub brought to the table here. What's funny is, like, if you like, my feeling at almost every moment is like, oh, Stephen King probably wrote this. And it's like, well, no, clearly no. Like, clearly Straub wrote roughly half of it. At least that's what we've been told. Now, there are parts of it where I would bet cash that Stephen King wrote that part specifically. But it was unusual that I was like, it was maybe a couple times where we were like, Straub wrote this, right? Maybe it happened like twice.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, hard for me to nail down my thoughts here, because it's weird. And overall, I can't say that I'm gonna miss the Straub King books, just because I just think that I love Stephen King's voice so much. Maybe that's a popular opinion, maybe not. I don't know, because there's some people who don't like Stephen King's writing voice, which is kind of crazy to me. But there's all kinds out there. Anyway, that I don't have very firm thoughts here, so I'm just gonna let you give your feelings on the Straub King partnership.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm really torn on the whole concept of multiple authors working on the same book. Because I feel like one of the strengths of novels in general is that, in the world of entertainment, in the world of storytelling, in the world of all these things, novels are one of the few things that's actually truly the closest possible thing to the work of one person. I mean, obviously, even with novels, you still usually have editors and people helping, craft the final version of the thing. So it's really not truly one person, but it's as close as it could possibly be. We talk about auteur theory all the time with films. It's like the furthest thing from the truth. Yes, obviously the director is a very important person who is directing the course of that film, but there are hundreds of people working on the movie. Same with television shows, same with video games, plays, any other form of storytelling. Novels, closest thing to just being one person. So I like that aspect. I like that aspect of you're picking up a book and this is the words of that one person. And I like when you have, the novels written by multiple people that are doing something with that concept. We talked about it when we did that discussion question. We talked about this is how you lose a time war, right? We talked about the Expanse series and how each author was writing a different section. We talked about these ways where you can use that to kind of make it so your two different voices become part of the story. Mm-hmm. And I guess the thing about these two novels is that's just not really what they do. And I do think, I felt like when we read The Talisman, it was much more clear to me which sections were Straub. Or, I mean, obviously we didn't know 100%, but I think we talked about that way less in Black House. And I think it's because way less of the book felt like Peter Straub to me. Mm-hmm. It felt so much like a Stephen King novel to me. I don't know. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's because the original idea was much more his than it was theirs. And so he was kind of dictating the flow of the story more than he had in the other book. I don't know. And I guess at the end of the day, like, when I look at these two books and I look at them compared to, like, I would say neither of these two books rises to the top of, like, my Stephen King tier list, if you want to call it that. Mm-hmm. I think there are solo Stephen King ventures that I love much, much, much more than these two books. And which isn't to say I didn't enjoy these books. Obviously I did. But I don't know. I felt like there's just something, maybe it's an ineffable, undescribable thing, but there's something missing in these two books that I see in the best Stephen King that just prevents them from rising into that that upper echelon. And I don't want to just say, well, that's Peter Straub's fault. And I don't think it's Peter Straub's fault. I think it's the fault of writing a book as two people.
Yeah. It can be really fun to co-write things with people, but there just always is a loss of clarity of like, what is this? What are we trying to achieve here? Because you just have slightly different aims, and I think it becomes unfocused. And I think both of these books suffer from that a little bit, at least. I think this one coheres and sticks the landing a lot better than the Talisman. So, but on the whole, I agree with you.
Yeah. Functional, enjoyable, but not greatness, especially compared with the Dark Tower. A series that obviously I loved to death. Yeah. Just doesn't stand up to me. All right, Matt, you ready to get into it? You ready to answer some other people's questions, not my questions?
Let's do it. Let's get into it.
All right. You want to take the first one?
Sure. The first question from Baby Can You Dig Your Sam? With the Duffer Brothers planning to adapt the Talisman, I'd love your comment on potential parallels between Stranger Things, particularly this most recent season, and Black House. Because I was reading this book and watching Stranger Things 4 at the same time, I was struck by several things. There could be some direct references to Black House, but it's probably just a lot of similar tropes. Both stories have an evil house that is a portal to another world or dimension that houses an evil entity who is killing kids. In Stranger Things 4, it's Henry Creel, it's Fisherman's Creel reference perhaps, and he can only be defeated by a kid with special powers. The Duffers certainly embrace tropes and homage. Other parallels? And then they also say, number 2, also, if Tyler's such a powerful breaker, wouldn't another one of the Crimson King's cronies come after him, especially after he destroys the big combination? Like, wouldn't he send another Terminator to bring John Connor to Algol Ciento? To answer the second question first, I mean, maybe he couldn't anymore. Maybe destroying the big combination really kind of took the wind out of his sails, and that's when he decided to go fuck off at the top of the Dark Tower and then got stuck on a balcony. Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, I think they say in this that he's already locked away, but I do. To continue answering the second question first, I do think there's certainly a realm of believability to the idea that Munchin had not told anyone about Ty yet. He just seems like the type of demon that would want to take full credit for it and make sure nobody else gets any credit. And so I'm going to keep this a secret until I waltz up delivering the most powerful breaker ever. Because I mean, like, this is a system that exists basically where the Crimson King is relying on these people like Lord Malshan, who are in turn farming out help from other people to kind of constantly be feeding them superpowered individuals, right? So obviously, like, the Crimson King and his direct goons are not like fully aware of all psychic people in all worlds, right? Or else they wouldn't need people like Malshan, and they wouldn't need people like Burnsides, right? So I think there's just a very good possibility that they just didn't know about him. And I mean, the dualistic reason is because there's no other books.
Right. Ran out of time. Yeah. So as for the first question, though, I have only ever seen season 1 of Stranger Things. I keep hearing like conflicting reports about whether I should watch the rest of it, and I guess currently I'm leaning toward not, just because I got a lot of stuff to watch. And anyway, I don't know what parallels you're talking about, but I mean, it does seem like these Duffer Brothers are fans of Stephen King, so I wouldn't be surprised if there were all kinds of parallels. Yeah,
I mean, Stranger Things obviously owes a whole lot to Stephen King, as well as Steven Spielberg, as well as anything else that happened in the 80s. And that's not a bad thing. I think there's a version of myself that got very snarky about this whole thing, especially when Stranger Things first started playing. That was like, at what point is homage and pastiche just taking
plagiarism?
And I don't care about that anymore, because like the honest truth is most of the people watching this thing have never seen any of that shit from the 80s, and are completely unaware of what it's referencing in the first place. And so if you're just making a thing like in season 4 of Stranger Things, there's a Kate Bush song, Running Up That Hill. It's a very good song, and it is featured very prominently in season 4, and it has blown up. And there's all these people that were really snarky on the internet about how like none of these kids even knew who Kate Bush was before now. And it's like, so what? Like they just discovered her now. That's great, right? Yeah, like that's cool. A good thing, right? That's cool. Why are we being snarky about this? And that's kind of where my feelings are on Stranger Things are right now. I thought season 2 was bad, and if there's any way you could, if you want to watch it, Matt, and just skip season 2, you could just do that. Okay. I thought 3 was pretty good. I think this is probably the best one since the first one. I still think the first one's better, which is good. It also has you kind of realize halfway through that they're just doing an Empire Strikes Back thing with it. And it's like, so the ending is not really an ending. So there's going to be season 5 is the finale of everything. And so really all the season is doing is like moving the pieces for the final season.
Gotcha.
But it's good. And yeah, like there's so many references to Stephen King. I mean, there's literally in the finale of season 4, a character is reading the talisman. Like he just has the talisman in his hand reading it. So, I mean, there are tons of references, tons of things. I mean, the Duffers are making a Talisman television show for Netflix. Like they are going to do that. I don't know when exactly, probably after Stranger Things is done, but they're doing that. So you could write a whole thesis on the ways in which Stranger Things is taking from Stephen King.
Cool. Well, I'll take your word for it.
But yeah, I would say, Matt, watch Stranger Things. It's fun.
Okay.
The only thing I'll say is that they divided season 4 into 2 volumes, to do the thing where it goes across 2 months. So you have to have a Netflix account for 2 months instead of 1 month.
Good stuff. Yeah.
And the second volume is just 2 episodes, but they're each like 2 to 2.5 hours each. And I'm just like, why?
It's kind of a weird way of doing that. Yeah.
Episodes aren't a thing in this show. Like, they don't, like, it's not like any of this is episodic. It's just they need a point to end. So honestly, what it must be is there was some algorithm or something, some data mined information that said that if you make your finale 2.5 hours long, then all the news sites are going to write about Stranger Things epic 2.5 hour finale. Yeah. Even if you just like took 5 episodes and just pushed them together, it just makes it seem bigger and more important. Therefore, more people watch it, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, you're totally right.
Anyway, I hope that answers your question, Sam. Next up, we have Complicated 9519, who says, as we know, Dan Torrance has an insane amount of the shine, touch, steam in him, something along the lines of the bottomless pit or close to it. We could say that the reason the Crimson King didn't hunt him down is because breakers weren't in existence yet and fully formed in King's mind. I'd love to hear you guys' headcanon as to why Danny flew under the radar, where people such as Brodigan and Tyler were hunted to the corners of the world for their power to break the beams. Pretty much, what is your idea why Dan Torrance wasn't kidnapped and brought to N-World? Well, you see, he's so powerful that he could hide.
Well, isn't that actually true textually? Well, like he was, he's hiding his light under a bushel or whatever. I think there's also entirely possible that Dan Torrance does not live on an Earth that so like, look, honestly, none of this really makes any sense. Because, like, is there one Dan Torrance? Or are there as many Dan Torrances as there are worlds? And if there are as many Dan Torrances as there are worlds, then the Crimson King only needs one of them. Or he could just get 50 of them. Or as many as you could possibly need.
Yeah, imagine an infinity Ted Brodigans all pumping each other up.
Right, just that room, except it's all just Ted Brodigans just amplifying each other. So like you have to just be like, you know what? there's different worlds. Maybe the Crimson King he only has so many henchmen, so he focuses on certain places, focuses on Keystone Earth a lot, focuses on a few other worlds maybe. I get a vibe that the Shining world is not necessarily the same world where Derry is. I have no substantiation for this, by the way. This is my vibe, and vibes are always right.
Yeah, I mean, I think The Shining, a movie, was referenced in The Dark Tower, right? In Eddie's world, I think. I can't remember.
Yeah,
can't remember which version of Earth they were talking about.
Well, I know Eddie knew about it, so
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the honest to God headcanon for me would be, after the events of The Shining, Dan Torrance, like if you read or watch Dr. Sleep, locked up his demons and kind of just turned off the shine, and spent the rest of his life until the events of that book intentionally shining as little as possible. So that's the type of thing that can just go unnoticed. And I mean, like, the thing about Ty is it wasn't like the Crimson King or Malshan or Burnside said, that kid right there has a lot of shine to him, let's get him. It was just Charlie Burnside being creepazoid, and they got him. And then when they got him, they were like, oh, well, look what we got here. We didn't know. Yeah. So, I don't know. It's that's my reasoning.
Yeah. You could also just, I mean, this is a totally different theory, but you could just say, like, there might be relatively few beings capable of sensing shine in the way that the Cantoi can. Like, we don't even know. Is it the Cantoi themselves that sense the shine? Is it something else? Like, we don't really know how that works, right? So the fact that they can track down Ted doesn't necessarily mean they can track down anybody who's shining anywhere at any time without a pretty good lead on them, Yeah. No, I think you're right. Okay. All right.
They do have a second question.
Okay.
They say the end of the book has something similar to The Dark Tower, where it says we can stop reading and we don't have to go further. Do you think this is something that Straub thought of and King liked it so much he decided to use it at the end of The Dark Tower too? Sure. I love that.
That would be,
I mean, honestly, it felt like a very King moment to me, but I don't know if that's just because I live in a world where I've already read The Dark Tower and know that was a King thing. So,
I mean, it would be delightful if that were true, but it feels like more of a Stephen King thing to me as well.
Yeah.
All right. Squatch42 says, I read the last 3 books of The Dark Tower as they were released, but never read either The Talisman or Black House until reading along with the podcast. I realized that my Dark Tower experience may have been a lot different if I had read the Proto-Dark Tower books before reading the Dark Tower books. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how the reading order of all these books affects your experience. What are the pros and cons of reading them in release order versus the order we read them for the podcast?
Yeah, I think we kind of already talked about this a little bit when we were talking about the dreaded chapter that we didn't like at all. Where we really got into the Dark Tower lore in a heavy way. I think if you were reading this book when it came out in 2001 and had not read the final 3 books of the Dark Tower because they did not exist yet, that chapter would have been a huge deal for you and you would have absolutely loved it. I read the Dark Tower, I did not read the Dark Tower as it was coming out, so I did not read this book in between. So I have never had that experience of the person who read them as they were coming out and was reading other King books in between as they were going. That was not my experience with the Dark Tower. So not the exact same as what Matt's experience is, but in this case it is, where I had read all the Dark Tower before I read both Talisman and Black House. So I think that would have been much more enjoyable had you been living in that time waiting for the Dark Tower to come out. I think this way of doing it does hurt that specific thing a lot. But I don't know. What do you think?
I'm trying to decide if I feel very strongly about this, because it's, there's a few different authors who kind of do this thing where their stories are all connected, or a lot of their stories are connected, but not in a way where it really matters to the plot. And and it's, for me, it's never much more than like a little like, oh yeah, you know, it's like it's not worth a whole lot to me. Not, and it's not a criticism either. It's just like, oh, okay, cool, you know. And so I guess like, this book doesn't spoil anything about Roland's journey, you know. Kind of gives us some tantalizing flavor of it's like, oh, this is the Dark Tower. It's Midworld. This is but then it's like, yeah, but it doesn't matter. Like again, we've kind of had to stress and theory craft to even see how it could matter. That like maybe this matters to breaking the Crimson King's power plant, and that actually matters somehow. But I'm like, I don't think it would have hurt my. I don't think reading the Dark Tower first hurt my reading experience of this, and I don't think if I had read this first, it would have hurt my reading experience of the Dark Tower. I'm sort of neutral on this.
Would it have made it better in any way?
No. I mean, the only thing that would have made it different and better would have been, like, hypothetically, if I was reading it as the books were being released, then there's a lot more excitement that can be like spread out, whereas you can't really cultivate that level of excitement when you're just reading a bunch of books that have been published already. Yeah,
I mean, I think kind of maybe what this question gets down to in the end is there a certain order of the King universe that you should undertake when reading these novels? You know, like, a lot of people are pretty strict about their, like, you read these Dark Tower books, and then you read this book, then you read these ones, and then you read this one. I have never been that person. I've never thought that. I have always thought that the best possible thing you can do about the Dark Tower is read all of the Dark Tower. And I genuinely don't. I think one of the best things about the Dark Tower is that it doesn't matter if you've read a single word of Stephen King, you will still fall in love with the series. And I think you were my test subject in that, really. And I know that wasn't entirely true because you read a couple books, but close enough, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's true. And I think the things that make the Dark Tower great are not that it is the center of this massive multiverse of Stephen King. I think the things that make the Dark Tower great are the individual books on their own, the characters on their own, the storytelling on its own. And the other stuff is cool and it's fun, but it's not why the series is great. And so my opinion has always been, if you want to read the Dark Tower, read the Dark Tower. If you want to read the stuff around the Dark Tower, read that stuff after. And I just don't think I don't think it will hurt your enjoyment of the Dark Tower at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think I did complain. Some of my few complaints about the Dark Tower were like the times when we would basically take a break from Eddie, Jake, and Susanna and Oy for hundreds of pages to learn about Magus. And it's like, obviously, the Magus story was a great story, but I want to continue the story of those other characters that I loved. And it's like, if you made me take a break in the middle of that book to read a whole nother book, I would have really lost the thread of my connection to those characters, I think. So I think there's some value to just, it's a story, right? A story to me has a connotation of being like about these people doing this thing, you know. You need to follow them through to the end without too many breaks. That's my feeling.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. I'm glad we agree on this.
Yeah. All right.
I think I'm the next one.
Yes, you're the next one.
JustStand8460 says, personally, I would have loved to have more Judy. Her character was very likable, and she didn't really have any flaws or faults that we could see, much like Henry. I don't say weaknesses, though. In a world where a spin-off story is written, what are your thoughts on Judy being the main character protagonist, short story or novel, past or future? Yeah, I liked Judy a lot. I do wish she was a more central, prominent figure in this book. She's certainly a big presence in the story, but I wish she was more of a character. And, part of me wonders, and this again, I'm going to go off to conjecture land, so please don't take anything I say here as fact. Part of me wonders if this isn't a story that combines a lot of ideas that King had been having, and some of the Judy stuff feels like a separate idea that he was having that he thought would work for the newest Jack Sawyer tale as well.
Yeah,
I don't know.
that feels right.
She feels like a classic Stephen King protagonist character in a lot of ways, and we just don't get to see too much of her.
I don't want to retcon and pretend I said something I didn't say, but I feel like I might have said at the time, like, oh, so I think Judy's going to be our main character, or one of our quartet of main characters.
I think that's right. Yeah.
And it was because like we finally landed in the point of view of somebody who was, number one, close to the central crux of what's happening in the story, eminently caught up in the drama of it, and then number two, like a classic badass gunslingery woman who is going to take no shit and not stop until her son is rescued. And then it's like, nope, none of that happened. Take her to the asylum. We see her twice more, and that surprised me. I really did think we were going to go that way.
Yeah, I mean, like a character that has been built to be like, she's badass, she has so much strength, so much power, like she's going to be instrumental to how this whole thing plays out.
Yeah. And then Sophie, you're like, oh, okay, well maybe like Sophie will take over that role and kind of be a similar person, but it's like, no, that doesn't happen either. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, it does feel like kind of a leftover piece of an idea that didn't quite make it.
Yeah. So if we ever get the opportunity for more Judy, yes, I would love it.
That'd be great. Sure. Yep. All right. Shortstop 88 says, last week I mentioned that I didn't care for this ending, but that opinion has nothing to do with Jack's end. His is perfect. I'm upset about how we didn't get to see Tyler's reunion with either of his parents. How do y'all feel about the Marshall's denouement not being included in this story? I myself would have liked at least a mention of it. I think I would have bet that they were going to do a Tyler meeting his parents moment, and the fact that we didn't get it does kind of feel interesting. It's like, wait a minute, what story were we telling then? I guess we were telling Jack's story, but I thought we were telling the story of rescuing Tyler, but then it kind of turns into something else. So
it is so funny. Like Stephen King books are so long, and sometimes his endings are just like, and it's like you would figure for like a 600, 700 page book, this is, we would have like a slower rollout to the ending where it's really just, they get out of Black House and then we do like a 10 pages of leading up to Jack getting shot, and then the book's over. Yeah, it's surprising. I agree. I think getting to see Judy get her son back would have been enjoyable. Yeah,
I agree. I actually just totally agree with that. No comment. And then Shortstop goes on to say, when looking up the talisman in both the Google overview or in the Wikipedia page, it lists the series the novel is part of as the Jack Sawyer trilogy. So my question for Scott is, do you have any idea if there's official announcement about this being a trilogy? Go ahead, Scott.
So, okay. Yes and no. Stephen King has said he has an idea for a third book in this series, but one thing or another has prevented them from doing it. I think Peter Straub has been in poor health for quite a while now. I think he said recently on, I think it was the Losers Club podcast interview, that people should really want the adaptation of the Talisman to be very successful, because if the adaptation of the Talisman is very successful, that might spur the chances of a third book in the series to be happening, because Stephen King is, after all is said and done, a very clever businessman as well. Yeah, I mean, there is an idea apparently that would exist to be a capper on this story, but it probably, with Peter Straub's health the way, it's probably not going to happen unless King kind of decides to just write it on his own. But I feel like this is the kind of thing that King would not want to do. Yeah. Like I think like this is their project together, and I feel like he would not want to write it without his friend.
Right. Yeah, I agree. So everybody just mail Stephen King an envelope full of cash and just inside it just say Talisman 3, please.
Yeah. All right. Jeffrey S. says, loved this book. It was tough getting into it, but once it got going, I couldn't put it down, and the ending totally killed me. The second the author stated we would not like the ending, I knew that there was going to be trouble. It was so good and sad. They also say, I have to say that J.K. Simmons just has to play Henry Layton in any adaptation of this. From the minute we meet Henry, I was picturing J.K. in the role, which is great, not because I agree, because I totally don't see that at all. But I think it's so funny how I think maybe by design, Henry Layton is so mutable.
Uh-huh.
Like, I just, like, we talked about this when we first were introduced to him, that like the entire time I read this book for the first time, I thought he was like 20 years younger than he actually was.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's about this character, and maybe it's, you know, all intentional, and it's because our authors are geniuses that like they made this character who's a man of many faces like come off the page to every reader as slightly different.
Yeah. I mean, I can see why you would go with J.K. Simmons, because you know J.K. Simmons could do George Rathbun and he could do the Rat, you know, like, because he is that kind of mutable actor who can do all those different things. But I will say, like, once again, Muller, the standard King audiobook reader, just blew me away with his portrayal of Henry Layton in a way where I'm just like, I don't know how else to see him, and so no actor jumped to mind. But no, that is fun, because I'm sure everybody has their own sense of who this particular character is. Really just a fascinating character, though. Really interesting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Jeffrey goes on to say, so Black House seems to leave an open possibility of another Jack story. What do you think the odds are that Fairy Tale might just be it? Fairy Tale being the Stephen King novel that is coming out in September of this year. As we just talked about, I don't think so, just because I really do think that if he was going to go back to the Jack Sawyer well, he would go there with Peter Straub. But I don't know. Like, Fairy Tale is definitely going to be a book in which a character goes to a different world. Will it be something like the Territories?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Or you know, I wouldn't be surprised if like it's not that closely related, but there is a mention of, you know, a two-headed parrot or a who knows, you know, lost Schwinn bicycle or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, judging by the name and the excerpt that I've read, it seems to be going much more like high fantasy type of fairy tale storytelling. Like, it's definitely a kid, you know, passing the threshold into a fantasy world, but it doesn't seem Territories-esque to me. But you never know.
We'll see. All right. Idolan Jones says, do you think it's possible Jack was at some point planned to be the newest member of the quartet in Wolves rather than Father Callahan? I'm not too sure of the timeline of when Cy King decided to put the pair into the series, but the lines at the end of the book about Jack potentially having a role yet to play makes me think that was at some point an option. Follow-up question. How do you think the series would go if Jack did take Callahan's place? It would presumably be the Callah's capisman rather than their holy man. Would King put him up against vampires in the final book, or would it be Mr. Munchen's kin? If there were ever a direct sequel to The Dark Tower following the next go-round of Roland's journey, I'd want it to be that, more of a what-if type book showing him with different quartet members to bounce off, personally. I gotta say, I like this idea. This is just fun to think about and imagine.
It is fun to think about. I don't think that was ever the idea. I don't have any knowledge to back this up, but I think that, like, to me, part of putting Callahan into this story specifically is Stephen King very intentionally going back to the very beginning of his career and pulling a character and an idea from the beginning of his career and bringing it forward to now, or the now that was when that book came out, and wrestling with it and thinking about it and putting it right in front of him. Because I think, you know, one of the things we talked about with Father Callahan a lot was how King's view on alcoholism changed between the depiction of Father Callahan in Salem's Lot and Father Callahan in Wolves of the Calla. Right. So I think it feels like that was a very intentional choice, and I don't think that would ever have been Jack's role. But I agree. It's very fun to think of how different the book would be if like you just start playing, like roll the dice of which Stephen King character shows up in Caliber and Sturgis, and how the story changes based on that. That's a very fun game for sure.
Right. There's also the idea that like Roland has different lessons to learn on different spins of the wheel, as it were, and maybe, you know, on some prior spin he learned some valuable lesson from Jack Sawyer.
I love that. That's great. How would it change? Oh man, what do you think?
I mean, it's interesting because Jack Sawyer is a much more similar character to Roland than Callahan is, even in ways where it's like Jack could either be another potential mentee to Roland in the way that Eddie is, or they could kind of have a rivalrous relationship because maybe Jack doesn't like the way Roland does things, or
I feel like they wouldn't get along, to be honest with you.
I agree. Like they're too similar actually, and maybe they disagree about how to go about something, and it becomes a contentious. They even have to battle or something. Like that's something I see being at least possible.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm thinking about are the ways in which Callahan and Roland butted heads in that novel, because one of the big ones was when they found out that there was a demon growing inside of Susanna, and like the refusal of the Catholic priest Callahan to even entertain the idea of aborting that thing, getting that thing out of there. How would that change if it was a police officer rather than a priest? How would that interaction change? Because that kind of dictates a lot of where the finale of the book happens, what happens in there. So how would that change? Also, how would having a very, very gifted, intelligent detective change the whole mystery of the Calla, right? Because that, like, certainly having someone like Jack on your side as you're trying to figure out what's going on here, who's taking people, why, where are they going? Like, he would be a huge ally in that, for sure.
And also, if you're going to leave all the other elements the same, which I'm not saying that you necessarily would want to leave every other element the same, but it would be fascinating to learn how Jack ended up in the Calla, right? Like if you're just positing that he ends up as the sheriff of the Calla, it's like, well, how did he go from being in this nursery room in the territories to being in this place at kind of the ass end of End World or whatever. I forget the names of places. But yeah, no, it's very fun to think about. Like thanks for the question, just because I'm sure I'm going to be kicking that around in my head for funsies.
Yeah, definitely. That's really cool. Thank you so much. BC Johnson says, why do you think Jack Sawyer never showed up in the Dark Tower series, despite getting a pretty clear flag here that he might? Yeah, so we've kind of had multiple questions of this, but this one just comes right and ask it, right?
Yeah.
Why did King decide to change his mind here? I don't know. I mean, I think he just couldn't find a way to work him in that made sense, that did anything for his character specifically and worked for the rest of them specifically. I think people rightfully so get bent out of shape about Patrick's sudden appearance in the final few chapters of the Dark Tower, and how this character suddenly shows up and he's there, and we're not really sure how to make of him, and it doesn't feel right that he's the last one with Roland at the very end. I understand all that, but I also think Patrick was doing a pretty important thing in like being like another son figure for Roland here at the very end, to kind of decide at the very last minute, what are you going to do with this kid? Yeah. Like, what have you learned? Like just a final test of what have you learned? And I don't know if, a 30-something-year-old Jack Sawyer showing up would accomplish the same thing. If it had been him in the place of that. So I don't know. I just think like when if you think of it in the most boring, mundane way possible, when you're Stephen King sitting down, kind of trying to search for where your story is going to go from here, if you just don't find an entrance point for this character, or maybe you wrote one and you wrote the sequence and you wrote the scene, and then you read it back and we're like, this none of this works.
Yeah.
This just doesn't work.
I think it would be really hard to do in a way that doesn't feel like Poochie showing up, where because it's like, hey, he's a gunslinger, and he's like younger and more handsome than Roland, and people like him more, and he's a detective, and it's like, okay, you want me to like this guy more than Roland? Fuck you, And I mean, I can see the reaction being negative almost no matter how you spun it, and unless you were like, in the intervening years, Jack has been through absolute hell and he's like a shadow of his former self. Then that could be interesting.
That could be a fun version of the character, yeah.
But I can see it falling flat, like it hitting in a way that's kind of like, what are we doing? Mm-hmm. When are we going to get to the fireworks factory? All right. Cool. Yeah. Thanks for all of the Dark Tower questions there. Mm-hmm. All right. Daniel D says, hola, curious if you think Steven had big plans for Jack in the Tower.
Oh, I should have screened these before I copy pasted them in.
Another one. The Sawyer trilogy is unlikely due to the bad health on Mr. Straub's part. If this story did continue, do you think he would play a major part in the final 3 books? He being Jack, I assume, right? Am I reading this correctly?
Yeah.
What do you think of Jack's inclusion in the Tower story would have looked like? Do you think he would have clicked with the quartet? Is it possible little Patrick Danville's part was initially going to be traveling Jack? So looks like we kind of already answered your question.
Yeah.
But I mean, I definitely. It's like it would feel really weird if the first 2 Talisman trilogy books were. Oh, I mean, it kind of has to be about Jack Sawyer if it's called the Jack Sawyer trilogy, right? So I would assume that Jack Sawyer has more yet to do. It's interesting because I can't imagine what. Like, it's really hard for me to think, where does this character go from here?
Yeah. What is that? That's the thing I want to know. Like, even if the book doesn't happen, I kind of want Stephen King to just tell me what the kernel of an idea he had for that 3rd story was.
It's interesting because the more I'm thinking about this whole idea is like, well, maybe I've got it all wrong, and the Jack Sawyer who would have even conceivably shown up was never going to be the golden boy Jack Sawyer. This is the Jack Sawyer who got shot 15 times in the neck and has a spiritual wound and has kind of changed in some way. And what does that look like? So that could be.
He's got to bang Sophie for the last 15 years.
So Sophie probably died like 6 months later.
You're such a pessimist.
I mean,
I love it.
We kind of already did it. We already did this to him one time, right? Like imagine Jack. It's like, all right, Jack, now time for your rest. She's dead again. You lost the woman immediately again. You get no reward. Good day, sir. That would be what Stephen King would do.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're probably right, actually. All right. So I think we basically answered all those, Daniel, throughout the last 20 minutes or so of our conversation.
Yeah.
So
Daniel also asks, are we going to do a Stephen King themed book club for at least one live interaction with the Kingslinger Folken? And to that I say, maybe.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think we've been kind of intentionally avoiding doing any more King books on the book club because we just didn't know what we were and weren't going to do as part of the show. So as that settles a little bit more, I think there's definitely going to be more opportunities to do King books on our monthly book club.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. You gotta vote for them when they do show up on the book club.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Jerk Stabworthy says, my question for you is, of the King books you've read, which other characters do you think are gunslingers in waiting? I'll start. I don't think I'm spoiling anything if I say Beverly in the Losers Club is one. Sheriff Alan Payneborn in Needful Things referred to having talented hands and proves to be a skilled and hardened diplomat/negotiator. Those are good ones, for sure. Matt, you got any yourself?
I was probably going to say the Needful Things guy because it was pretty clear. It's interesting because there's some books where it's like kind of nobody. Like I think I would actually specifically say nobody in Salem's Lot impressed me enough to be called a gunslinger. Mm-hmm. maybe Mark Petrie when he grows up is going to be a gunslinger.
He definitely the closest. And
Yeah.
I mean, the thing I'm thinking about the most is him escaping. Like, it's a real gunslinger move of getting yourself out of that bad situation.
Yeah. Yeah. The best friend of the prince in Eyes of the Dragon, he could be a gunslinger.
No, if he was a gunslinger, you'd remember his name.
That's an excellent point. Excellent point. Yeah, no, it's hard to think of him because it is a very specific character archetype, and I don't think he uses it all that often. Cool.
You're talking about Ben, right?
But I guess, but see that confuses me because he used the name Ben for.
He uses a lot of the same names.
Yeah, I guess I'm talking about Ben. All right. Sigma says, now that we've finished Black House and pretty much the works for this podcast, which were made with the intention of tying into the Dark Tower, how do you feel about companion series? How should they be done in respect to references and crossovers with the parent series? For example, prolific manga group Clamp, and that's like an acronym, I guess, made an attempt to tie all their works together by making a world-hopping manga which featured motifs, allusions, and crossovers with their previous works. I have mixed feeling on that aspect, especially as it relates to, I can't pronounce that word, XXX Holic, which was made as a sister series as opposed to retroactive world building. This is a thesis worth of material. I've just asked you.
Let's answer it as simply as possible. You go first, Matt.
I mean, I've it's like this is kind of like what Star Wars is at this point, right? Where there's like this just like rambling endless acres of content with different varying questionable levels of canonicity. And my opinion is like, yeah, some of it's good, some of it's not. I don't think it's intrinsically a good or a bad idea. It's more like as long as you realize that it's all just a bunch of different artists playing in a playground, and that and that's how you have to interpret it to have fun with it. Yeah.
The correct thing to do in this is to not make any of it required reading, watching, blah blah blah. Right?
Yeah.
Like
right. Because if we're gonna be fully cynical, the reason you do something like this is to like trick people into reading something else they might not have read otherwise.
Yep.
It's just going to be honest. Like that's what it is. That's why a new author writes a new Star Wars novel instead of writing their own creative thing. It's because they expect that you'll read their shit because it's Star Wars, right? Mm-hmm. That's why you do all of the crossovers and the tie-ins and the shared universes and all of this. And that can be fine because you can do all kinds of good stuff by playing in somebody else's sandbox, but it can also be shitty. There you go.
Yeah. Yeah, and I kind of repeat myself from before, but like the reason I love the Dark Tower is because the Dark Tower is a really, really great standalone story that has wonderful characters, and so all this stuff is cool. And obviously, like I think honestly, Matt, I think there's a version of this very podcast we're doing that is much more into the nuances and the minutia of the tie-in stuff, and spends considerably more time talking about all that. And people might like that better. It's not the thing about any of these stories that interests me the most. And so it tends to be the things, we talk, I feel like when we talk about Dark Tower and Talisman, Dark Tower and Black House, we're almost always talking about theme and characters and things like these, and not like specific, like, well, what does it mean if this person is actually this guy? It's just like I don't know, like I don't need it. I don't need it. Like it's cool, but I just don't need it. And it's one of the things that scares me away from comic books because there's so much of that. Like so many things you have to read. It's also what the MCU is very rapidly becoming. Is like the barrier to entry of joining this thing is watch 40 hours of movie and TV shows so you can understand what's going on before you go watch the new thing. I don't think that's good. And I think the thing that Stephen King does the best with all of this stuff is none of it is required reading for any of it else. The only things I'd say in this entire Dark Tower series that are required reading are the numbered ones that come before in the series itself.
Yeah,
that's
right. I think that I agree. Yeah. If it's like, oh, well, you have to read, it's like, no, I don't. I shouldn't have
you don't.
to.
Yeah, you don't. You don't.
Yep.
You don't. We could have stopped the show after the first season, and I think I would have been very content with you getting to experience a Dark Tower. The reason we decided to do this is really just to give us an excuse to talk about Stephen King more. Like, to me, it really had nothing to do with, oh, let's like talk more about the specific minutia of how these things touch the Dark Tower. It was just, these are cool stories. Let's talk about them more.
Yeah.
And also we could talk a little bit about how they connect to the Dark Tower.
And the other thing, I mean, I hope I don't make people mad, but like every time we do touch upon the stuff where it's like, this is how it references the Dark Tower, very often we end up kind of laughing about the fact that it doesn't quite work. Like, or it's kind of it's just kind of a silly throwaway thing that King did because it would be fun, but it's not like, it's not like he has some like czar of canon integrity looking over his shoulder, making sure that it all hangs together, because it indeed does not very often.
Yeah.
So
I agree. All right. Fellow says, Scott and Matt, what are some of your favorite bands, musicians, musical genres, etc.? From the podcast, we get a good sense of your taste in literature and film, so I'm curious to hear you talk about music. Matt, why don't you take this one first?
You know, this may or may not be, surprising, but like I actually really like to listen to film soundtracks, and I always have. Even when I was a teenager, I would like.
Yeah, I can confirm that. By the way,
I'd have favorite movies, and then I would get the soundtrack on CD, and I'd listen to the soundtracks, and then interestingly, a lot of my musical tastes from there came from like, a band would be on a soundtrack, like for example, The Matrix. Interestingly, there's a Matrix soundtrack CD, and then there's like the actual band songs from The Matrix, which is a totally different thing. And then you like follow up on those artists, and you're like, oh, that's cool. And you get their CDs. So like basically starting there and then branching out. I like progressive rock as a genre. I think it's fair to say my favorite single band is Tool. I like, I play guitar, so I like bands that have complicated guitar stuff going on.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like for a second you were going to get through that whole answer without saying the word Tool, and
no, that would be dishonest. And but I also like classical music. Not in a deep way. It's funny because like my mom and brother are both like diehard classical musicians. So I feel like a complete idiot novice, but I do like classical music. Just all of the boring composers that everyone has heard of. I'm not esoteric. I'm very basic in that way. That's about it for me. How about you, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not a huge music person. I like music, certainly, and I'm basically the type of person who listen to music when everyone listens to music is when they're a teenager, right? And then I just like stop listening to music after that, and so all the music I like is the same stuff that I was listening to when I was 18 through 22, I guess, probably more realistically like 14 through 22, I guess, which was a lot of alt rock. I think that one of the things that did happen though is I took a class called The History of Rock and Roll in college, which is like my favorite elective that I took in college, because it was basically just like a teacher like he brought his iPod to class and hooked it up and then played a song and that's like, here, I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes telling you exactly why this song was hugely influential and extremely important and changed music forever. And that made me really fall in love with the Beatles as not just like, hey, they're good music, but also like, holy shit, like if you understand what these guys are doing with music, like you know how crazy it is that they did all this stuff. And so I really like the Beatles, which is like one of the most boring answers ever, but I don't care because they're really good. I like them.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say music is not like a focus area for either of us, but music's great. Of course, music's great.
Podcasts have really dipped into my music listening time for sure.
Yeah, me too. All right, next we have from I'm Like Okay. This is the last question, by the way. As a lifelong constant reader, it's hard for me to parse out what is common pop culture knowledge and what isn't when it comes to King. Matt, what's your prior knowledge, if any, of The Stand?
And this, of course, is asked because that is the book we will be starting next week, Matt. So our final question is going to transition us beautifully into our next book.
Yeah.
So
thanks for that. I'm like, okay, very thoughtful.
Yeah.
So I think even before we started this project, I think I had the awareness that The Stand is a post-apocalyptic virus. Virus has wiped out the Earth, whatever, some level of survivors, and I think that we're following bands of survivors, and I think that the Man in Black is involved somehow, which is probably a lot of cultural osmosis knowledge, right? Like,
yeah, that's a fair amount. Yeah,
I mean, obviously, I'm missing some things. I probably even have some other character names bubbling around in my head, but that's probably from more recently, like overhearing stuff about like the new the TV series that was made more recently and stuff like
sure.
that. And you know, I don't know, I probably know another smattering of details here and there, like I don't want like I think this is the book where King was like, I didn't know how to finish it, so I just killed a bunch of my characters. I think that's this book. So, well, in any case, the thing about me and spoilers is I have almost never thought that spoilers mattered. I can think of like two books where two pieces of media, full stop, where I think it matters to not be spoiled. So I don't really care, but I probably know more about this than I have about almost any of the other books that we've read.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a big deal, right? This is, out of every book we've covered this season, I think this is absolutely, unquestionably the biggest. Mm-hmm. One of King's masterpieces, I think, pretty safe to say. One of my favorite books, for sure. A book I'm very, very excited to talk to you about very extensively, because we're going to be here a long time, Matt. Mm-hmm. We begin this book next week, and we will not be leaving its pages until November 3rd. November 3rd.
All right.
We will not be done with our coverage of The Stand until the week before Thanksgiving, because we're going to also talk about both the 1994 and 2020 miniseries after we finish both those. We finish that book. So
nice.
It's going to be 16 episodes talking about the book, 2 episodes talking about those miniseries, and then that'll be it for our second season. So we're finishing it with a bang here. I'm excited. I'm excited to talk about this book with you. I put this at the end for a very intentional reason, because it's the big boy. I love this book so much. I'm a little nervous, honestly. I'm a little nervous because I love this book so much that I want to make sure I do it justice as I'm kind of leading you through it.
Sure. Well, that makes me super excited. I mean, I'm sure you will. You know, you've led us this far, Scott. But yeah, that's like you said, this is the one everybody raves about, right? So, mm-hmm. I've loved a lot of these books that people don't necessarily rave about. So I'm sure I will love this one, and that makes me really happy and excited. Yeah,
some truly incredible writing in this thing. It's going to be a lot of fun. Can't wait. That will begin next week. And just so everyone knows, we'll be getting a few questions about this again. We will be covering the re-release version of The Stand. I guess you could call it the uncut version, the extended edition, whatever. Basically, when Stephen King was first writing this book, he was not a huge shut up editors, I can do whatever I want name. And they basically told him he had to cut 300 pages from the book. So he did. And then he became a huge shut up, I can do whatever I want name person. And he put them back in and re-released the book. So we will be reading the longer version. It's not like I didn't like make a choice because I'm like, this is the better version of The Stand. Honestly, it's because there's only one version in print anymore, and it's the longer version. They don't print the short cut version of the book anymore, and there's no audiobook for it. So like, this is the one we're covering because we want everyone to follow along. So it's the one we have to do.
Sounds reasonable to me.
There will be, I'm not an expert about what was and wasn't in the original versus the extended. I mean, there are a couple whole scenes that were cut out, and I'll talk about those as we get to them. But I'm definitely not an expert of the differences between the two of them. So
Yeah, it can be interesting to talk about that kind of thing. So maybe talk about that some amount.
So you'll be like, I don't know, Scott, this scene seems completely unnecessary and superfluous. Well, man, would it surprise you to learn that it was?
That's funny. Okay, cool.
But that is The Stand, and that will begin next week. We're going to be reading chapters 1 through 9 of The Stand next week. Oh my gosh, so excited. But that's it for us this week, and that's it for Black House, and that's it for Peter Straub. Thank you so much, Peter. It was good to hang out with you for a few months.
Yeah, that was a refreshing detour.
Yeah.
All right. So remember, you can reach us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter at kingslingerspod. And of course, I guess we don't have a discussion question per week this week per se, but you can just head on over to the Reddit at r/doofmedia and see what's going on over there. Just get everybody all hyped up about the beginning of The Stand.
Yeah, definitely. If you're not already subscribed to Kingslingers, you're going to want to be, because we're covering The Stand. So subscribe now. Basically anywhere you can find. There's a whole list. I don't say it anymore because everyone knows it, but just subscribe.
Yeah. Yep. And if you like the Kingslingers, which is not actually the name of the show, and you want to support us, then please consider donating to our Patreon account at patreon.com/doofmedia.
The Kingslingers. We should just change it to The Kingslingers.
Of course. Go ahead.
Of course, if you cannot afford to donate to us, that is absolutely okay. You can always help us out by sharing the podcast, and of course, by leaving us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or any social media podcasting platform that allows you to do so. This week's spotlight review comes from Bunnybear13227, who gives us 5 stars and says, "Love it. Cujo has been saved. Now we have to save season 3. I've been listening since somewhere in the haze of early 2020, and I've kept up ever since. As a constant reader, I typically don't reread the stories along with the hosts, but I enjoy revisiting these classics all the same. I've journeyed to the tower multiple times with both the books and the audiobooks, and when I make the journey again, I'll have these episodes to revisit and enrich the experience. Always great to meet more tower junkies." I agree, Bunny Bear. Thank you so much, and thank you for listening, and thank you for leaving that review.
Yeah, really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thanks you to everyone who has left those ratings and reviews. I think we're getting close to a milestone on the old Apple podcasts. Yeah, I think we're at 395 reviews, which is almost 400, which is a number that matters somehow because it has 2 zeros in it.
That's amazing.
It is. I mean, it is pretty remarkably amazing. If you look at the percentages of people that leave ratings versus that listen, there's a lot of you out there.
Yeah. I wasn't being sarcastic. It's great. Yeah.
It kind of came off as sarcastic.
I really appreciate that's remarkable. That's remarkable. It feels really good. It's almost kind of intimidating actually. And I don't actually think about that fact that often because it's humbling, I guess. Mm-hmm. And it feels, but also feels nice. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We really do appreciate it. I can't wait to begin this big, honking, huge book that I'm holding in my hand right now with you. It's going to be so much fun. Get your copy of The Stand if you haven't already, and get ready to read because it begins next week. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.